is in his 60s.
Hi, everyone. I'd like to drift back in the general direction of your seat. After this panel, we're going to have a longer coffee break, and we can even open the door to the terrace, which is really beautiful outside. Those of you who don't know, this facility is called Casa Italiana. It was actually a gift of the Italian government to Columbia University. And somewhat ironically, it was actually Mussolini's government that planned this building. So there are some fascist design experts turning in their graves as we enjoy this conference. My name is Michael Morris. I'm the director of a program called the Program on Social Intelligence. And the mission of that program at the business school is to try to bring cutting-edge insights from psychology and related fields to the world of management and the world of leadership education. And that's exactly what we're trying to do today. We're really looking at research here that is at the vanguard of science. These are the kind of insights that are creating a lot of excitement in the world of science. They're not yet filtered down to the pages of the New York Times. So we're really involved in the first stage here of trying to grapple with these insights and think about what are the policy implications, what does it mean for managers, what new insights do we have from knowing how the brain is involved in these aspects of stereotyping. So our keynote panel, we were so lucky to have Susan Fiske, who, as Malia told you, is probably one of the most influential living psychologists, both in terms of her scientific citations and in terms of the work she's done, communicating these insights to the Supreme Court and other important audiences. With our research panel now, we're going to have a slight change of pace. Because this is such a cutting-edge topic, so many of the real experts on this topic are earlier in their career. They're the emerging leaders, the people who are, building research programs at the top universities. And we have 4 emerging leaders in this field who look at different aspects of the territory that Susan Fiske has laid out for us. First, we're going to hear from Lasana Harris, who's visiting us from Duke University. And Lasana is going to tell us about how the stereotypes that Susan described affect very consequential moral decisions that we make towards groups. So it's not just how we perceive them, it's how we act towards them. The next talk by Dana Carney, who's at Columbia Business School, will be showing that consequential decisions are affected even by people like physicians, who are trained to be very even-handed and trained to be very rational and objective. Nonetheless, their stereotypes still affect the treatment decisions that they make. The third talk by David Amodio, who came up from NYU, is going to look more deeply at the brain mechanisms that are involved with an eye to the question of how can these social perceivers who can't help stereotypes being in their minds because they're so pervasive in the culture, how can these social perceivers try to regulate the impact of stereotypes on their decisions and on their behavior? And then our final talk by Valerie Purdy-Vons, who's from the Columbia Psych Department, will be looking at the other side of the question, which is the targeted people, the groups that are stereotyped, they also know these stereotypes. They also can be affected by these stereotypes and how these stereotypes get into their own thoughts. And what she's looking at is how can we help the stereotyped people regulate the effect of stereotypes on their performance. And then after 15-minute presentations from each of the speakers on the panel, we're going to have 30 minutes for Q&A and interactive discussion, and then another 30 minutes for our main coffee break. So I'm going to turn it over now to Lasana Harris.
All right, can you all hear me? Okay, great. I'd like to begin by clearing up 2 confusions. First of all, I'm male, not female. This is a common error that has happened to me. My name is stereotyped as female, so very fitting in a stereotyping conference. And secondly, I'm at New York University for the next year, so that's why my slide says NYU. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about a lot of the stuff where Susan left off, specifically looking at the low warmth, low competence cell, and how people make decisions about those groups. I always begin by thanking the many people who are instrumental in getting this research done, as well as some of the funding sources. Okay. So I'll begin by talking to you very briefly about discuss within the content of the stereotype content model, as well about how we're going to measure disgust. Then I'll talk to you about 3 different kinds of moral decisions: fairness norms, trust and subsequent vengeance, and then valuing life, deciding who lives and who dies. And then finally, I'll sum up. So as Susan said before, warmth and competence interact to produce distinct affective responses to different kinds of social groups. One such response towards groups who elicit low warmth and low competence is disgust. Previous work we have has shown that if you just show participants pictures, stereotypical pictures of different social groups, and ask them in a forced choice context to indicate what emotion they feel towards these groups, most participants agree with our a priori predictions of where different social groups lie in the SCM space. So for instance, groups seen as highly warm and highly competent elicit pride, high warmth, low competence elicit pity, high competence, low warmth elicits envy, and then low groups elicit disgust. If you look at the neural activation patterns when people simply look at pictures of these groups, you commonly find that the social cognition network that Susan mentioned before is active. Again, one common area of that social cognition network is medial prefrontal cortex, which is this strip of cortex running right down the middle here. What we've seen before is that generally these pictures activate MPFC along with other areas involved in social cognition, precuneus, etc. However, groups that are seen as low in competence, low in warmth, those that elicit disgust, fail to activate this part of the brain above our many different baselines, suggesting that people aren't getting into their heads as much and are valuing them a lot less than they do other people. The inference I'm going to make is that since we know from other research that affect influences decision making, maybe disgust as a moral emotion may influence moral decision making towards these different groups. The way we're going to measure disgust as an emotion is by looking at some physiological marker, because affect elicits both brain and bodily responses. In particular, I'm going to focus on this muscle right here called the levator labis superior muscle. This is a muscle that gets involved in the disgust facial expression. So for instance, when you're making a disgust face like this guy is, this is the muscle that at the same time flares your nostrils and raises your upper lip, 2 features of that disgust facial expression. I'll also talk to you in the 3rd study about evidence from neuroimaging. Okay, so how are we going to measure these different norms? The first study tries to assess fairness norm in the context of a 3rd-party punishment scenario. So in this game, there's a dictator and a recipient, and our participant sort of sits back and observes these 2 people interacting. The dictator has an opportunity to transfer money to the recipient, and then our participant can punish the dictator based on his behavior. So on each round, we give the dictator $1, and he can either make a fair or unfair decision. If he's unfair, he'll only give 10 cents to the recipient. If he's being fair, he'll give half of the money to the recipient. And then our participant can then sit back and choose how to punish the dictator. What we do in this game is we take pictures of neutral white males, and we simply pair them with different kinds of stories that imply either they belong to the low warmth, low competence group, or they belong to the high group, so the cultural default group. So for instance, we'll take this guy and pair him with a story of drug possession charges. We'll take this other guy and pair him with a more heroic story. So we're manipulating here who is the dictator and who's the recipient, and whether the dictator is being fair or unfair towards the recipient. The idea is that our participants will integrate these both sets of information and then make their decisions about how much to punish the dictator. And they punish the dictator by taking money away from him. What we see is that when the dictator is a hero and he behaves unfairly, he does get punished, but not nearly as much as when he's portrayed as a drug addict. So therefore, participants are punishing our bad dictators more heavily. You even see this very strange effect where even if the bad guy behaves in a fair manner, there's some residual punishment towards him. When we look at what the levator muscle is doing, so this measure of physiological disgust, we see that in the case of the good dictator, again, there's slight increase in levator activity when he behaves unfairly compared to fairly. This is what you'd expect. However, quite interestingly, the pattern reverses for the bad guy. So it's as if we expect the bad guy to behave unfairly. So when he does so, we don't have a strong disgust response. It's consistent with our expectation. However, when he behaves fairly, we get this disgust response. And maybe that's accounting for this slight increase in disgust for fair punishment. However, punishment isn't only about punishing the offender. It's also about restoring the victim. For instance, in the recent Bernie Madoff trial, the judge said that one of the reasons he's passing his harsh sentences is so that the victims can have some sense of closure and feel some sense of justice on their behalf. So we also punish norm violators on behalf of the victims. When you look at punishment when the hero had something good or fair versus bad or unfair happen to him, we see that people punish on behalf of the hero much more than they do on behalf of the bad person, the drug addict, or low self, right? So there's this difference. It's as if people aren't restoring or low social groups to the same extent as they're willing to restore our in-groups. When you look at levator activity, you see the same pattern that you saw for the dictator. When something good happens to the low group, the bad person, you get this big levator response, right? Which is a little sad when you think about it. Something good happens to someone portrayed as low warmth, low competence, and people have this physiological disgust response. We also switch gears a bit and now study our punishment norms within a separate context. So before I move to that study, I'll just sum up the third-party study showing that there's this increased disgust response when dictators receive fair benefits. When a low cell receives fair benefits, participants are much more willing to punish our dictators harshly for the same crimes. This begins to suggest that there are different sets of rules, moral rules, that are being used to evaluate our low cell versus the in-groups. The second study assesses both trust and a vengeance motive in a second-party punishment context. In this context, we have someone in the role of trustee and someone in the role of investor, or our subject. So we put our subjects in the role of investor. The way this game works is that the trustee can make a transfer to the investor, right, after the investor has decided whether or not to initially trust the trustee and give the trustee his money. And our investor then has a turn to punish the trustee. So in this context, punishment is a direct result of behavior towards you, right? You're not punishing on someone else's behalf or punishing according to some overarching moral rule. You're punishing based on your own experiences. So in this game, there's the investor. He's given $1. The investor can keep this $1, in which case he has $1 at the end of the trial, or he can share the $1 with the trustee, so give it to the trustee. The reason he may want to do that is because when he shares the money, it gets tripled, so the trustee receives $3, and now the trustee can either keep that $3, violating the investor's trust, activating a vengeance motive, or he can share the $1 with the investor, returning the trust. Therefore, the investor ends up with 50 cents more than he would have if he had not trusted the trustee. Clear so far? Okay. In this case, we also pair pictures with different newspaper stories. So we manipulated the category, either one of our low categories, homeless people, and we would pair them with stories that suggested they were either responsible for their outcome in life. So in this case, the person drank away their money and ended up in a scenario where they were on the street, or a case where they weren't responsible for their outcome in life. So some kind of natural disaster occurred, making the person homeless, right? So remember, the default, as Susan mentioned before, is to think that people deserve their stance in life. So if it is that you're homeless, you're probably responsible, so we're manipulating that variable. The second category that we use isn't the in-group this time. We decided to use our pitied out groups, so the high warmth, low competence groups. And again, we manipulated whether they were responsible. So either the person ended up disabled because of drunk driving, for instance, had a car accident, ended up in wheelchair, or was born with some kind of birth defect that eventually led to degeneration and was suddenly disabled. All right, so they're either responsible or not for their outcome in life, and they're either pitied or disgusted outgroups. Let's first look at the trusting behavior. The blue bars are participants' evaluations of how trustworthy these groups are before the experiment begins, and the red bars are the evaluations at the end of the experiment. And you can see that the homeless guys who are at fault for their scenario in life aren't trusted from the outset compared to the disabled who aren't at fault, or even the disabled guys who are at fault, suggesting that, as we said before, these low groups and the subsequent disgust they elicit leads to different moral evaluations than other groups may receive. In the context of our game, the trustee returns money 50% of the time, so on half of the trials. So therefore, by the end of the experiment, all the subjects that say have the same ratings of the different groups. However, we still don't see that, where there's still this perseverant decrease in trustworthiness, even though all of the groups, have behaved in the same way. I'll get that later. This graph shows you decisions about keeping the money. So for instance, you're the investor, and you have to decide whether to share that money or not. When the person is not responsible for their outcome in life, regardless of their social group, people tend to keep their money less. So they're more willing then to trust the trustee when the person is not responsible. However, if that person is responsible for their outcome in life, people are less willing to trust the trustee, okay? If we look at the Levator response at this initial stage of the experiment, we see a similar pattern where, again, when they're not responsible, the Levator doesn't differentiate. There's no differential disgust activity. However, when they are responsible for their outcome in life, we see increased Levator activity towards our disabled groups compared to our homeless groups. Again, this is consistent with the previous study showing this reduction in Levator activity towards our low groups, presumably because we assume they're responsible for their situation by default. So it's not disgusting, it's not surprising to see them in a consistent manner. However, our disabled people get an opposite Levator response. This is data from actual punishment decisions. So after our subjects have either invested their money or not and have had the money returned or not, they have the opportunity to punish, and here's their punishment. So again, they punish in the same way by taking money away from the trustee. You see that for people who are not responsible for their outcome in life, participants are punishing them much more harshly than those who are responsible for their outcomes in life. The maroon bars here are what represents when the money was not returned, so your trust was violated. And this is a very interesting experiment, because when we debrief participants afterwards, they would tell us things like, oh, I felt so betrayed when that disabled guy didn't give me my money back, right? So participants going just based on the social category, right, based on the information we've given them, with expectations about how the person should or should not behave. And those expectations get either confirmed or not. If we look just at the social target, again, looking just at the Levator response, at this punishment decision phase, we see a very similar pattern where when the person is not responsible for their situation in life, but they violated your trust, you get this huge Levator response, right? So you're very disgusted by that behavior. Here's where the betrayal occurs. However, if the person is seen as responsible in life, again, there's no real difference. You're expecting them to behave in a negative manner anyway, so there's no need to get all upset. If we look again by social category instead of responsibility, so again, reciprocate, no reciprocate, you see the same pattern. So again, with disabled subjects, they're treated like those who are not responsible for their outcome in life. Participants punish them much more harshly than they punish the homeless people for the violation of trust. Again, presumably because we expect the homeless people to violate our trust. And as you saw from the previous graphs, people aren't trusting them to the same extent anyway. When you look at the Levator response, again, very similar pattern. The disabled people, when they're not returning our money, are eliciting this huge disgust response, again, because we've been betrayed by these people. However, the homeless people, the Levator doesn't differentiate whether they returned your money or not, suggesting again that people are using a different set of moral rules when judging these different social groups. So again, to quickly sum up, it seems that there's this increased physiological disgust to homeless targets at fault. So one thing I'd like to point out thus far, it seems that the way emotion is working in this context, at least based on the data from these two studies, is that there's this negative relationship when you're considering the other person's motives, right? So if it's a homeless person and you're considering how to punish that person for violating some norm, you're seeing a reduction in Levator activity that's correlating with the extent to which you punish them. However, when you're punishing on your own behalf, there's much more of a positive relationship. Again, the emotion is driving your own behavior. There's increased Levator, you punish more harshly. I'm quickly running out of time, so I'm going to very briefly tell you about this final experiment. I promise it'll take 1 minute. This is work that we did in collaboration with Mina Sikara and Susan Fisk. Mina is sitting right here. In this study, we wanted to see if people would value their lives differently. Again, based on the idea that they are low warmth, low competence, they're not seen as very useful members of society. So maybe people would treat them much more as a means to an end than other social groups. So in this study, we borrowed the trolley dilemma from moral psychology. The trolley dilemma goes as follows. There's this runaway streetcar. It's barreling down these tracks, and if nothing happens, it'll run into these 5 people who are on the line. However, there's a guy, Joe, he's standing right here, and he can save these 5 people if he's willing to push this one guy off of this bridge in front of the streetcar, killing him, but again, saving these 5 people. So it's a moral trade-off. And generally, you find that subjects say that it's not acceptable for Joe to push this guy because no one wants to endorse murdering someone, even if it's for the benefit of others. There are some people, utilitarian people, who make the cool calculation and say, yes, push the guy, you're saving 5 people. But generally, most people say it's not acceptable. We manipulated who was being saved and who was being sacrificed, okay? So you could push a homeless guy to save 5 rich people, for instance. Participants tell us it's much more acceptable to sacrifice the targets that elicit disgust compared to any of the other SCM emotions. And it's also much more acceptable to save the in-groups, right? Those that elicit pride. And it's least acceptable to save those that elicit disgust. If you look at the brain regions, you find that for that interaction where you're pushing the homeless guy to save the in-group, you get activity in the social cognition network suggesting you're thinking about the in-group's benefits. And you also get activity in cognitive control regions, presumably to override that impulse you have not to kill someone. So now you're overriding that kill impulse so you can push the homeless guy to save your in-group. So to sum up, it seems that disgust in particular is related to moral decision-making. People that elicit disgust aren't necessarily judged by the same set of moral rules that we use to judge other kinds of social groups. Questions?
Take all of our questions after all 4 talks. So Dana Carney will speak next.
Yeah, sorry. Just give us a few minutes. Yep. The clicker works. Sorry. Hang on. This one. Can we just check that works? Sorry. Yes. Good. Good.
Hi. So I'm Dana Carney. Can you guys hear me when I'm out here? Okay, good. No? Lavalier? All right. All right, so for those of us who study human thinking and feeling, we've known for some time that the rationality of the human mind is bounded. Early work by judgment and decision-making researchers like Herbert Simon, Daniel Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and also work in social psychology by our very own Susan Fisk, they've all shown us all the kinds of ways in which human judgments and decisions aren't rational. One of the ways in which they aren't is that we are sort of driven to make judgments and decisions very rapidly and very efficiently. One of these sort of efficient ways that we make judgments and decisions is the use of stereotypes. So stereotypes can sort of shape the way that we interface with the world in a way that try to sort of make our judgments more efficient, but really the byproduct is that we end up treating different social group members in an unfair way. So what I'm going to talk about today is some work that shows that physicians' biases, that is biases that suggest that black patients are less competent than white patients, that those biases actually predict treatment decisions. So, physicians historically have taken the Hippocratic Oath, right? This Hippocratic Oath is this explicit statement that they are going to treat people based on whether they're sick or well, not based on what social group they belong to or what gender they are or what religion they are. And in some lengthy discussions with some of our colleagues at the medical school, it became clear to us that physicians really believed that their minds were a little bit different. And we agree that physicians, they're trained to be really egalitarian and that they are probably a more ethical and just group. We did not think that their minds would be any different than the rest of ours in terms of how easily we sort of adopt these the cultural knowledge of stereotypes and things like that. So we wanted to ask the question of whether their social group biases predicted treatment decisions. One of the reasons why we didn't think that physicians would be kind of immune to this is that we know that implicit racial biases, that is to say, those less deep, or rather those less conscious biases, the ones that kind of simmer below the surface. So, we all can either say, yes, I like this social group more or less, but most of us would say, I like different social groups equally. But at the same time, while we'll say that, most of us also demonstrate a sort of deeper, on a deeper mental level, a link between different social groups and negative or positive attributes. And so the work the work that's been presented today by Susan Fisk and Lasana Harris has kind of shown that, on this automatic gut level, we actually have these sort of preferences for different social groups, even though we don't want to have them, even though we may believe that we don't. So one of the reasons we thought that physicians would not be immune to having these kinds of biases is that they predict all kinds of things. Implicit biases predict nonverbal negativity toward black relative to white individuals. They predict attributions of hostility to black faces relative to white faces. And so we believe that the physicians would have racial bias just like the rest of us. And what we were trying to do is make sense out of this effect that it continued to appear in the literature. So there's a ton of public health data and also data in the medical literature that shows very clear differences between black and white patients and how likely they are to be diagnosed with different coronary artery problems. And so in addition to these data, there have been also experimental data that have shown the same idea, that blacks are less likely to be diagnosed than whites for coronary artery disease and that they're less likely to be treated. Now, a lot of work, a lot of time and energy has gone into trying to figure out why these disparities exist. And a number of different factors have been looked at, things like socioeconomic factors, right? Things that you would ask, well, why have you looked at socioeconomic status as a potential predictor of this? They have. And they've also looked at access to care, and none of these things appear to predict, or sort of make sense of why these diagnosis and treatment disparities exist. But the medical literature and the public health literature kept coming up with the question, well, what about physician bias? Could this be what's going on? And so that was the goal of the study that we did. We wanted to test the hypothesis that physician bias would predict treatment decision. So what we did was we surveyed internal and emergency medicine physicians. There were 302 of them in the Massachusetts area and also in Georgia. And what we did was we recruited them to come to a password-protected website where we could ask them some questions. And what we did was we showed them a vignette of two different patients, one black and one white, that had come to the emergency room. And then we asked them to render a treatment decision. What would you treat this patient or not? And then we asked them, after the vignette, to take different measures of racial bias. Explicit measures, where we asked them, do you have a preference for this social group or the other social group? And also an implicit measure of racial bias. We took a number of different implicit measures, one of which measured attitude, so do you like this group more than that group? But we also were interested in stereotype, which, as we've seen today from Susan Fisk's work, that, and also Lasana's work, that they're different kinds of things. We were interested in this stereotype that physicians have, or that we thought that physicians might have, that black patients would be less compliant than white patients. So we are interested in both of those things. So let me show you what the vignette looked like. Mr. Thompson presented to the emergency room. Mr. Thompson was either a white Mr. Thompson or he was a black Mr. Thompson. And he was a 50-year-old male. He had a history of hypertension. And he had come to the emergency room with some chest pain. It was about an 8 on a 10-point scale. His EKG showed some abnormalities, but there was no prior EKG for comparison. And so then, it's a little bit ambiguous for the physicians. But clearly, when physicians were just given this description without the picture and pretest, they all said that it was something that most of them said, yeah, this person should be treated. So there was a little bit of variability in pretest, but for the most part, this is a case where, yeah, you would probably want to treat this person. And then we asked them, given the information available to you, would you recommend thrombolysis for this patient? Now, thrombolysis is a fairly non-invasive blood thinning drug that can be administered in the office with some ease. And so, there's not a lot of risk associated with it. And so there's no reason, there's not, it's not that there's no reason not to give it, but there's not a lot to hold a physician back from giving this blood thinning drug, and it can actually help a great deal. And so the physicians had to say either no or yes. And then, as I said, we measured both explicit racial bias and implicit racial bias. And so we were interested in not only what was the extent to which these physicians held racial biases, both explicit and implicit, but also did they predict treatment. So 67 of our physicians, so these were resident physicians, and they all knew each other and spent a lot of time together, and 67 of them reported that they had awareness of the study. They had talked to their colleagues, and they kind of knew what the study was about. So I'm going to hold them aside for a second, and the data I'm going to show you will be based on the rest of the sample, but then we'll revisit these 67 because they did something very interesting. So here are the results for the physicians and the extent to which they demonstrated racial bias. So like ordinary people in this country, they said, hey, I like black and white people the same. I don't think that whites are more competent than blacks, or rather more compliant, and I don't like them more. But if you measure them with an implicit measure that sort of gets at deeper associations in the mind that can come from their own personal experiences, but also from their exposure to the culture and media and so on, what you see is that they have a degree of racial bias, implicit racial bias, that's on par with ordinary people. So on the x-axis here is a Cohen's effect size D, so that these two measures are directly comparable. And you see they don't show explicit, but they do show implicit. The point being that their minds look like the rest of our minds. So then to get to the question of did this bias predict treatment decision? So I can tell you that the measure of explicit racial bias did not predict anything. There was no relationship between explicit racial bias and whether I was more or less likely to treat a black or a white patient. But these are the data for the implicit racial bias measure. So on the x-axis here, you see implicit bias from low to high. And on the y-axis is treatment. No, I didn't treat the patient, or yes, I did. And so let me show you the data for the white patient first. So this shows a relationship between implicit bias and choosing to treat the white patient. So let me point out that higher implicit bias means I dislike blacks and I like whites. So what this little line here says is, the more I like white people, the more I'm likely to treat them in this situation where they should probably be treated. But in contrast, when the patient was black, you see the opposite effect. where the less I like black people, the less likely I am to treat them for this thing that they really ought to be treated for. And so I can tell you that this graph depicts the relationship for the negative attitude measure. So this is a preference measure. But you see roughly the same pattern for the measure of this stereotype about how compliant I think the patients would be. Okay, so recall that there were 67 subjects, or rather physicians, who said that they were aware of something about the study. They knew this was a study about race. We were really interested in what their data looked like, because there's some work that I've been doing, and I've seen work in the literature by Nicole Shelton, some by Wendy Mendez. We're starting to see these overcorrection effects. When people are aware that race is an issue, you can kind of overcompensate. And so far, it seems like we're going a little overboard. We're doing a little too much to try to compensate for. So this is good. We're going in the right direction. We're just going, it seems like a little overboard. So you see here the same axes, implicit bias on the x-axis and treatment on the y. When the physicians were unaware of the study's goals, this is the data that I just showed you. So this is always about the black patient here. When you're unaware of the study's purpose, the more biased you are against blacks, the less likely you are to treat them. But when you were aware of the study's goals, interestingly, the more bias you had, you were very, very likely to treat the black patient. So I think this is a positive message here. It's simply that, in this context, treating was the right answer, sort of. And so, to the extent that I was aware that race could be playing a role in my judgment, I can correct for that in a way that is a little more adaptive or a little more rational. Okay, so in summary, in a rapid judgment context, it appears that physicians' bias did influence medical decision-making. And physician rationality was no less bounded than the rest of ours. And awareness did lead to overcorrection, which I think is a step in the right direction, but it's something that we really need a lot more research about. And something I want to just point out is that, here's a sort of, you could imagine a decision-making trajectory for a physician where there's lots of points along this continuum. So, you first see a patient, then there's an examination process, then there's a process of diagnosis, and then a decision is made, and then the actual recommendation is made. I think that there's this sort of question of physician bias and how it creeps into the decision-making process. There's a lot more that could be done, because there's a lot of places that bias could creep in along this continuum. So it's in red and it's difficult to see, but I pointed out here that the affective kinds of biases probably creep in the very beginning of the decision-making process, right when you first see the patient, right? And so you could imagine that the affect measure that I showed you data for probably were influencing this part of the decision-making trajectory. Whereas the compliance stereotype probably in the real world comes a little later, right? I could perfectly well realize that this person has coronary artery problems and that they need treatment, but whether or not I actually recommend that they take thrombolysis could actually happen much later, when I actually have to act on that decision and recommend, here's what I want you to do. And so the bottom line is simply this, that implicit racial bias predicted an important treatment decision in this rapid judgment context.
Well, thanks for inviting me. Special thanks to Malia, Michael, and Bruce also. And it's a real pleasure to be able to talk at a meeting like this, where we'll be able to interact from folks in social psychology, neuroscience, and management in the business world. Also a real treat always to be able to speak in a symposium associated with Susan Fisk. Everything you heard about her is absolutely true. So, and then the rest of you. So thanks again. Let me give you a little overview of my talk. The question that I want to deal with today, and actually it's something I deal with throughout most of my work, is how are stereotypes and prejudice regulated? So in real life, people have alluded to these things being pervasive. It's a major challenge is how do you overcome them so that they don't come out in your behavior, which I think is the main issue. And so that will inform how we might design interventions that might be able to be can be used in organizations to deal with these issues. The approach that I take in this work is primarily social psychological, which means I like to examine the basic mechanisms of implicit race bias using the traditional tools of social cognition. But I also incorporate models and methods from neuroscience, and that's the theme of this symposium. And so I'll get into how I've done this toward the end of looking at self-regulation. And so in this talk, I'm going to give you a little brief introduction on the neuroscience model of implicit bias, which I think is key to consider before moving into the regulation side of these things. And I'm going to try to stay on schedule. I think I'm ruining Michael's time here. But then I'm going to get into an fMRI study on the processes, so I'll try to show you how I've studied this empirically. Okay, so here's a brief background on stereotypes and what I'm going to call affective biases. In general, and this has been studied for nearly 100 years now, these distinctions, but stereotypes refer to knowledge about a social group. You've heard a lot about this from Susan's talk already, and tends to be content-based, so it's attributions you might have. So you know that Italians, I'll use my own background groups, Italians we're passionate, but we're maybe a little lazy when it comes time to doing some work. And the Irish like to drink, but sorry, I was visiting my brother in Italy a few days ago, so maybe I'm just thinking about my brother. Anyway, that's an example of stereotypes. I shouldn't ad-lib. I know, it's a bad idea. On the other hand, affective forms of bias, people think of as more basic emotional responses. They don't have content per se. It's usually more of a global response that you have usually in reaction to people. All of these terms are complicated, but I'm going to focus on these more basic definitions for now. So one thing that's interesting in the field of social psychology and social cognition is that in terms of the mechanisms that drive these types of processes, they've in the past been assumed to reflect a common underlying cognitive type of mechanism. So even though you might think of affect and stereotype content as different, they're still coming from representations in some sort of semantic network. They're measured in similar ways with reaction time measures usually. And they're also have been vulnerable to a similar problem, which is that implicit measures of these things don't always predict behavior so well. This has been sort of a thorn in the side of this literature. And so it occurred to me, especially in graduate school and after that, maybe if I could use the brain, things that we know about how the brain works, to get a better understanding of the underlying mechanisms for more affective forms of bias and more content-related stereotypes, that might give us some inroads into understanding when implicit biases come out in behavior and then how we might regulate them. So very briefly, I often allude to this neuroscience model of memory, which distinguishes between explicit and implicit forms of memory. Usually implicit processes are thought of as one common type of mechanism in our literature, but if you go to the cognitive neuroscience literature, you see that people distinguish several different kinds of implicit processes. Even more interestingly is that each of these has been associated with distinct neural substrates. So in the brain, you could pull these things apart, manipulate them separately, and presumably different forms of implicit bias that might map onto these should work in different ways. So I'm going to focus on affective forms of bias that have been linked to, for example, classical fear conditioning systems in subcortical regions of the brain. And indeed, more affective forms of race bias have been associated with regions such as the amygdala and other subcortical structures. I'm not going to get into that research. By contrast, another pathway, you might say, of implicit processing involves conceptual stereotype associations. This has been linked to other regions of the brain, and that's been supported by some of my research also. If you take that mapping seriously of implicit stereotyping and implicit affect, and once you link it to the brain, you could go to the neuroscience literature and take everything that people know about those mechanisms of memory and start applying it to your questions of implicit bias. You get to learn a few things about how implicit stereotyping and affective bias might operate differently. So according to those neuroscience models of memory, they may be acquired in different ways. Affective associations happen in a single response. More content-related might take more time. They're both automatically activated. There's been a lot of research suggesting that. They get expressed in different ways. Like Susan Fisk has reminded us in a 92 paper, and William James has said, thinking is for doing. Stereotypes probably lead to actions, and they get expressed in that way. Affective biases, basic level things, seem to get expressed in different types of behaviors, maybe like nonverbals, as Dana alluded to. And this has been shown in a few studies behaviorally. They might get extinguished differently. I'm not going to get into this, but again, this is important information. low-level classical fear conditioning never goes away. You could learn over it, but it's always going to be there, and there's a lot of animal data on this. I think this has important implications for how we deal with regulating implicit bias. Now to my question. So that's all the preamble. Given all that, I realize I'm going fast, but I'm trying to pack a lot in. What can that tell us about how these things may be regulated? Again, I go to the brain, and so based on brain models, might it suggest that there are different ways for regulating stereotypes versus affective forms of bias? Let me skip this. Okay. So let me just start with our favorite friend, Phineas Gage. Most of you probably know who this guy is. I'm getting to appreciate him more and more as I get older in this business. He's famous for his tamping iron incident. Tamping happily on his iron in 1843 as a miner. Hits some gunpowder, spark goes off, bam. That's my acting out of this. Rod goes right through his skull, knocks out his frontal cortex. What happens to Phineas? He gets unruly. He gets this PFC damage, that's the prefrontal cortex. It unleashes his animal passions, that's how they used to describe it. Sorry, this formatting got messed up, but so the inference, though, is that this frontal cortex was really important for control, and that's really guided a lot of cognitive research on self-regulation since. So I like to look now at more modern models of the prefrontal cortex to try to understand how control might work if it's related to the PFC. I'm not going to go through all this, but this is an informative mapping of different regions in the prefrontal cortex with connections to different regions in other parts of the brain that might give us insights. So, for example, let's see. Let me go back for a second. I'm going to focus on lateral regions of the frontal cortex and then later on medial regions of the frontal cortex. And what's interesting, if you look at the anatomical connections, these lateral PFC regions have major projections to other parts of the brain that have been associated with representing goals, actions, tuning your perceptions, really an active approach to the environment, acting on things. In particular, there's lateralization. On the right side, the prefrontal cortex has been recently linked to inhibiting responses. So if you need to inhibit a stereotypic response, that might be an important mechanism. And so based on, I'm not getting into all the details, so you'll have to just take my word for it on some of this, that seems like that might be an important mechanism for stereotyping. What about affective forms of responses? Is the same sort of mechanism involved in regulating affective responses? Well, traditional views of regulating emotion tend to suggest this internal regulation of affective systems, like this idea that maybe the prefrontal cortex somehow downregulates the amygdala. The amygdala is often implicated as an emotion area. It's kind of Freudian if you think of it. It's like you've got the id and the ego, they're fighting it out. One's going to downregulate the other, and then what comes out is, pure gold, or you're purely regulated. But it doesn't seem like that maps on very well to the brain. Unfortunately, here's a little, you could ignore a lot of this, but importantly, this is kind of like a heat map of how well different parts of the frontal cortex are actually connected to the amygdala. And even among the connections between those areas, most of them go from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. Basically, it's low-level systems saying, hey, high-level systems, let's get going and take control. So as an alternative in this work, I've suggested that the medial frontal cortex may actually have an important regulatory role. Let me quick tell you why. This part of the brain, as Lasana mentioned, Susan maybe too, is important in representing social knowledge. I've proposed that it's really important for integrating your own actions with your expected actions of your external social world and monitoring those things. And then importantly, I think for what I'm about to get to is Lasana Harris, Susan Fisk have talked about humanization being related to this same type of process. So seeing a person in a more enriched and humane type of way seems to involve this region. So let me quickly now tell you the one study that I did to get at this using fMRI. I wanted to look at the neural processes linked to regulating stereotypes versus affective biases to see if it showed that pattern that I'm suggesting. Okay, so I'll skip the predictions, which should be kind of obvious just for time. I think this, especially in this setting, has important implications because if we do see these different forms of regulation, it might suggest that different psychological mechanisms are at play, and you might also want to try alternative interventions for these things. Okay, so here's what we did. We got 16 white American participants, not a lot, but it's kind of the status quo for imaging studies. I thought that's good. And they had this main task in the fMRI scanner. And here, we really wanted to engage subjects in this process of making affective or trait stereotype types of decisions. A lot of studies just show a picture of a face and try to infer what's going on from the brain. Well, here we really wanted to engage them. And they were going to make different judgments of black versus white faces. And bear with me, I have a little bit of a fun, elaborate cover story. Outside the scanner, we took measures of prejudice and stereotyping. That's straightforward, but here's the cover story. We told participants that we're testing people's ability to infer information about a person from a picture. Of course, every undergrad thinks, of course I can do that. I look at a person, I know everything about them. They're really very confident, so they buy our cover story. And for example, can you just look at a picture of a person and tell whether that's somebody that you would be friends with? Can you tell the types of activities that they like to engage in? Pretty much all of the undergrads say, of course I can. And that's why you use cover stories that play to their overconfidences, I think. So we say, all right, you're going to see a set of people's faces, pairs of faces. You're going to judge them on different criteria, like are you friends with them? Would you be friends with them? Or do they engage in this type of activity? And we're going to be able to test your accuracy in these judgments because everyone that you're going to see, we've also asked them, what kind of friend do they like? What kind of activities do they like? So we'll be able to match you up. There's accuracy here. So that really engaged the subjects. All right, we'll compare that information. So in line with that, we have them complete their own measures. What kind of friend do you like? Somebody who likes funny movies, good sense of humor, serious talks, I don't know. What kind of activities do you like? So they really bought it. I don't say that maliciously, but if you want to do a good ecologically valid study, you really have to engage them. All right, so they're going to make these judgments. We said for the activities, you're going to have to choose one type of judgment, just to make things simple. So pick one out of a cup of a bunch of different pieces of paper. Well, all of them said athletic because that's a common black stereotype. So they're going to make judgments about whether someone's going to be their friend or whether someone is athletic, right? Almost done. They viewed pairs of faces, all right? Again, made those two types of judgments. They saw white, black, and Asian faces. Sometimes they judged faces of the same race. I'll show you pictures of these in a sec. Like these, all right? So which of these two white guys is more athletic? Which of these two black guys is more athletic? There's no real need for regulating your response here because if you say this guy's more athletic, this black guy here, well, that doesn't mean you're using stereotypes, right? Similarly, they did it with the friends. And again, with these, you don't have to regulate anything. If you say this guy is more likely to be your friend than that guy, no one's going to say you're prejudiced, right? Okay, so those are kind of our controls. Now we showed them mixed race pairs also. Now you have to regulate. If you say, well, this black guy is less likely to be my friend, you might look bad, right? Okay, so this was an event related within block design. I won't get into the parameters. You could ask me afterward if you want. Let me just show you the results now quickly. We have a lot of different behavioral measures. I'll skip most, but tell you one. People were slower in responding to the mixed race faces than the same race faces. That was just one indicator that they're actually trying to regulate, be more careful. Now for the main findings, the patterns of brain activity. First of all, when they're just looking at mixed race faces compared with the ones the same race where they don't have to regulate, I'll just show you a quick brain map. We get the usual suspects in terms of brain activations associated with control. We see anterior cingulate, areas of medial frontal cortex, and some right frontal activity. That's kind of like making sure the measure works. All right, now I'll show you our main finding, because we wanted to compare this trait-based stereotype regulation versus the affect types of regulation. So first let me show you when they're making trait judgments, subtracting out when they're making this friendship judgments. All right? And this is when I was suggesting more lateral frontal activity. And here's what we found. I'm showing you sagittal and coronal so you could see both angles. But importantly, this on the right side of the frontal cortex, there's really strong, this is a conservative test also of cluster-corrected activity in the right frontal cortex, nothing in the medial frontal cortex with this contrast. Now let's take a look at when they're making these affective, are you going to be my friend? This is like Susan's friend or foe, really important decision. Subtracting out the trait judgments. Here I was suggesting more medial frontal cortex, and indeed that's what we found in this area right here. Nothing in the right frontal or the lateral frontal regions. Just to throw those slides both up against each other, you can see a nice dissociation effect. Okay, I'm going to wrap things up, give you a quick interpretation of the findings. So one idea from this is that stereotypes are regulated by changing your goals or inhibiting the expression of a bias. It's hard to inhibit things that are in your mind already, but you could definitely inhibit the expression of those. In terms of affective bias, I'm suggesting that instead of trying to downregulate directly any kinds of emotional effects, we could really regulate affective bias by what I like to call this engagement of more social cognition. It's like humanization. This is regulation. You know some guy who's purple is going to walk into your office in 2 seconds, and you're like, that sounds pretty scary. Well, the purple guy walks in, and you realize that he does interesting things and has good friends, and he's a nice person, and you sort of open up, and that's the engagement, and that's the humanization and enriching your social cognition of that person. That's a lot different than a downregulation kind of Freudian view of how control happens. Okay, and then finally, my last slide, for interventions, this is something that I'd like to make contact to. It's not really my main business, but how do you regulate affective bias? Well, it involves seeing people in new and more human light. All right, don't try to suppress things. You've got to open up to them, that engagement. So interventions should highlight the humanity of a person, promote social interactions. Stereotypes, well, according to what I'm seeing, I think it involves knowing that they're there, being aware of these things, and vigilant so that you can get in there and withhold expressions of the stereotype. I think your mind is like a sponge. It's hard to inhibit things that come to mind, but you can at least inhibit how they come out. Okay, and finally, the acknowledgements. I just quick acknowledge Trish Devine, who was instrumental in launching me in this direction for some things, and some of my collaborators on this. So thank you very much.
It's never fun to go last, so I pulled a back muscle. So Dana, I'm bringing you with me when I go to the doctor's office. Like, no stereotyping here. So good afternoon. My name is Valerie Purdy-Vons. I'm an assistant professor in the psych department over here at Columbia. The title of my talk is Combating the Negative Effects of Stereotypes, Improving Minority Performance with a Values Affirmation Intervention. This is work that I've been doing for the past 3 years in collaboration with Jeffrey Cohen, who is a professor at the Stanford School of Education, and also Julio Garcia, who is a research scientist for our school-based research project. And so to begin, in a modern pluralistic society and in many organizations in the United States, the primary project, particularly for organizations that have had a history of discrimination or exclusion or marginalization of certain group members, the primary project is the project of inclusion or inclusive leadership. And that is trying to understand how one can fully incorporate all members of the society at all levels of society into that organization. Also to ensure that group identity, one's race, gender, age, sexual orientation, religious status, region, physical limitations are not a barrier that constrains their opportunities in that organization. And when we think about how are we doing relative to this question, this project of inclusive leadership, you can look at it from two different sides. So on the one hand, there has been tremendous progress, and there's no place else to think about this than the campus of Columbia University, where there is tremendous diversity. I was actually an undergraduate here, I won't tell you how long ago, but I was an undergraduate here, and I'm just in my mind cracking up because we were never told what this building was. We were never allowed in here. So now I get to give this talk. And so, and when you think about the tremendous diversity from, say, the freshmen that arrived here 2 weeks ago, all the way up to the office of the provost and the presidency, you can see that tremendous progress has been made. But you can juxtapose that with the idea that still progress still needs to happen and that there are still many challenges. For example, in this same institution, there are continuing racial achievement gaps, whether it be at the level of freshmen or at the level of doctoral students. Minority students continue to achieve less well relative to how they should in compared to majority students. Over here, there is an example of a hate crime that just happened a few years ago at Teachers College where someone someone hung a noose on the door of an African-American professor. And so from the vantage point of those that psychologists call targets of stigma, those who contend with the possibility of stigma in society, this psychological space between knowing that your group identity may constrain your opportunities, but also that there are opportunities in a given organization. This juxtaposition is an interesting psychological question that drives a lot of the work that I do. And it drives two of the research questions that are the focus of the work I'm going to talk about today. One is, what are the consequences of contending with bias, discrimination, and stereotypes on performance, motivation, and leadership aspirations? I'm mostly going to talk about performance. The bottom line story being that when you are in a situation where you're contending with bias, contending with negative stereotypes, that this can have a debilitating effect on performance, that it can undermine performance, motivation, and achievement. And if this is the case, that lends itself to the second question of how can we reduce these negative effects of stereotyping and undermining of performance in real time in organizational settings. And so there are two psychology claims or premises that underline the work that I'm going to talk about. The first is that social identity matters. And that it plays a central role in intellectual performance, motivation, and leadership aspirations. And when most people think about how do you perform, people think of typical things like how much intelligence, how much stuff do you actually have, do you bring with you, how hard do you work, how high is your education, where did your parents go to school? And while all of those are contributing factors in terms of your intellectual performance, we would like to argue that your social identity, the group that you bring with you in an organization, also contributes to performance. If you're sitting next to someone who shares your racial identity, or you're sitting with someone who's in your sorority, this can be motivating. But also when you are concerned about being stereotyped or pigeonholed based on a group identity, this can undermine performance. And so that lends itself to the second psychological claim, that in these specific situations in which individuals could be treated in light of a negative stereotype about their group, people experience stress, that this is a unique form of stress that only targets of stigma feel in that situation. And finally, that one way to reduce this form of stress, and I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, is to provide people with opportunities to affirm their values, to think about things that are important and enduring values about themselves, things that are important to their friends, their family, their religion, their church, and that in those moments, this can reduce stress. And I'll come back to this in a moment. So these claims are based on many, many people in psychology, but one of them who is influential, our provost, Claude Steele, who is also my graduate advisor, and we continue to collaborate, used the definition of stereotype threat to define this experience of how group identity can affect intellectual performance. And this quote from one of the seminal papers reads that members of stereotype groups are especially wary of situations in which their behavior can confirm that their group lacks a valued ability. The extra pressure caused by the fear of reinforcing this negative stereotype can interfere with academic performance. And we now know that it can interfere with all kinds of intellectual performance, not just academic performance. And so I don't have time to get into the studies. There have been over 300, probably 500 studies by now showing that when you have a group, whether it be African Americans in intellectual settings, women in science settings, firefighters in a firehouse with all men, that these kinds of situations, when you can be treated in light of a negative stereotype, can undermine performance. And this is just a quick example of the kinds of identities and the kinds of performances that can be compromised, whether it be African Americans and academic performance being undermined, or women in science and technology studies, Latino Americans and academic performance, people who are low socioeconomic status, white males uniquely in comparison to Asian American males in science and technology subjects, as well as older adults in the context of memory kinds of tasks. And so this is a pervasive form of threat. And the question that guides my research is, what can we do about it? And there are many things that you can do. You can try to objectively change the situation so that these stereotypes no longer exist. But the focus of the work that I do thinks about the psychological climate. What can we do as a prophylactic to try to buffer people against the negative effects of stereotype threat? And that lends itself to this third claim that is going to drive the rest of the research that I'm going to talk about, that one way to reduce this stress associated with stereotype threat is to provide people with opportunities to affirm their values. The idea that you can shore up their self-integrity, the idea that you can remind people in that moment that they are worthy and valuable people, that this can be a source of stress. So the idea or the theories around self-affirmation, also a great deal of it also coming from Claude Steele's work, is that the basic definition is that it's a reminder of a source of self-worth or an important value. Each one of you in this room have something that is important and valuable to you. Is it your partner? Is it your spouse? Is it your rabbit? Is it your car? Is it your vacation? Is it your church, your sorority? These are things that are enduring values that are important to you. And this research is based on the premise that in a moment that's stress, this is not particularly stressful for you, although it is somewhat stressful for me, so this wouldn't have any relevance to you, but if I'm thinking about my own enduring values, what's important to me in a moment of stress, it can reduce stress and allow you to perform to the best of your ability. A lot of this work is really based on work on cancer treatment, smoking cessation, keeping people on diets, being open to condom use and threatening health information, showing that self-affirmation can reduce stress and allow people to engage in activities that may be threatening to themselves. Also, along with self-affirmation, there's also group affirmation, that you cannot just think about your own values based on your own identity, but values based on your group identity, your church, your sorority, your fraternity, or importantly, for this line of research, your racial group membership. And so one of the questions that I was interested in is, can we actually use these self and group affirmations? We know that they work in the domain of health, but can we take them in the domain of intellectual performance, knowing that there is a situation that is stressful uniquely for minorities and intellectual domains, insert these opportunities to affirm the values and lift performance, just reducing these kinds of achievement gaps that we see in many of the organizations that we're all a part of. So in this first program of research, we were interested in asking this very question in a laboratory setting that tried to mirror what actually happens in real world. This is work that I've done starting in collaboration with Kavita Reddy, a fourth-year graduate student here at Columbia. In this experiment with black and white participants, approximately 100, I was giggling at the 16 participants. I was like, oh, geez. Black and white undergraduates come into the lab, and they were asked to take 3 sections of a simulation of a math GRE. Each were 10 minutes each. They came into the lab one at a time. They were randomly assigned by a flip of a coin to one of 3 conditions. So they were given different kinds of affirmation instructions. In one condition, we had a control condition where we asked them they saw the kinds of values that were important to them on a sheet of paper: music, art, friends, family, religion. But we said, we want you to write about this value, but write about a value that's unimportant to someone else, and to write a paragraph about that. And that served as our control condition. In the self-affirmation condition, where we were interested in this idea of reducing the stress associated with these negative stereotypes, we asked them to write about a value that's important to you: friends, family, music, church, art, creativity, politics, success. In the group affirmation condition, we were hypothesizing that you should be able to use your group in the same way as a source of enduring values. So we asked them to write about values that are important to your social group, your group of people at a church, a choir, a fraternity, a sorority, or your racial group. What we then measured was test performance, which is the number of questions correct given the number of questions that were attempted. And so first I want to show you some of the participant-generated responses, because a lot of people think that this is really, they're just writing about themselves and that maybe this is just self-esteem, but they're really uniquely engaging values that are important to them. So in the self-affirmation condition, this is a quote from an African-American participant, and he said that music and art are important to me on a very personal level because they are things I use to keep my head on straight, vent my emotions and frustration, and I am rarely without them. He was referring to his headphones. I cannot imagine what a different person I would be without my headphones on. In the group affirmation condition, I really like to show this because it's an example. It's not about self-esteem, that this is not something that's uniquely positive, but it's a value that's enduring and important to this individual. So this says this is also by an African-American participant, says there is a hierarchy in America, and like it or not, my group isn't that high up. Because of this, I feel obligated to do my best to try to push this group up the ladder. You can say this is the most important group to me because I feel a duty and responsibility to it. There is no way of removing, even when I wanted to, myself from this group, so I feel committed to it. And the question of interest is, what is the effect of this on academic performance? So what I want to show you here is on the y-axis, this is test accuracy, higher numbers meaning more accurate, and in the control condition, this looks very similar to the kinds of achievement gaps we see in my classroom and many of your classrooms and many organizations. The green bars are the white participants, the gray bars are the black participants, and white participants are doing significantly better on this test. Interestingly, in the self-affirmation condition, when people are writing about themselves, and in the group affirmation, when they're writing about the group, we are able to significantly reduce the achievement gap. Black students are doing significantly better in both the self-affirmation and the group affirmation condition relative to black students in the control condition. The idea that we can reduce the stress associated with a negative stereotype and boost performance. So this was a series of experiments that were done in a laboratory, and the second question we were interested in is, could we move this into the lab? I'm looking at 2 minutes. Could we move this into a laboratory setting, out of the lab and into an actual school system? This is work on a series of self-affirmation field experiments. We use 7th graders in a middle school research site. The idea that 7th grade is really a time where there's a downward trend in performance and exacerbation of the achievement gap between black and white middle school students. Our student body was mixed between 50% white and 50% black. What we did is that we had a series of these structured writing exercises. It was double-blind, randomized experimental trials. The teachers knew that an experiment was happening, but we integrated it into the curriculum. They didn't know which kids were in the treatment or the control condition, and the students did not know that they were in a study. We sort of waited a long time before we introduced the affirmation. They were very similar to what we did with the college students. There was a control condition where they write about their values that are unimportant to someone else, a self-affirmation condition where they write about values that are important to them. This is what it looks like in terms of the kinds of values that are important to middle school students. I'm going to have to skip this in terms of what is a lot of the psychology behind this. But just to show you excerpts of what little kids, 12, 13-year-olds are writing about. One student said, art is important to me because it makes me feel calm. When I'm very upset, like I'm going to cry, I sit down and start listening to music or start drawing a picture. If I didn't have creativity, I'd be bored out of my mind, etc. So what we find is that these self-affirmations timed before tests in school can actually have a dramatic effect on achievement at the end of the school year. We collected their grades based on official transcripts. On the y-axis are grades on official transcripts of how the students did in the school year. For white students, there is no effect. This corresponds to approximately a B. Regardless of the control or affirmation condition, white students are doing the same in terms of performance. But for minority students, there is a unique boost for the minority students, specifically African-American students in the affirmation condition. Thus, it doesn't completely close the achievement gap, but it significantly reduces it. And these are end-of-quarter grades in social studies. We have since replicated this effect 3 different times in science class, math class. Oh, this says stop. Can I just show one more experiment? Science, math, social studies. We have also shown just most recently that when you track these students over time, over the course of their tenure in middle school, these types of effects persist over the course of 2 years until they go into high school. We're now doing some follow-up work with them in high school. I'm going to skip this. But the last thing that I just wanted to show you, and this is some work I've been doing in collaboration with Chris Crew, a second-year graduate student at Columbia, is that we wanted to test this idea of President Obama as an affirmation, not just focusing on the self or the group, but focusing on him. And this is based on lots of work in the media, the idea that he's a role model, and could this actually be a source of value? So this is data that we just recently collected in the same school district, 6th graders, evenly distributed versus black and whites. They were randomly assigned to 2 different instructions. They were asked to either write about whether it's important for you to be in good health in the control condition. In the treatment condition, they were asked to, is it important to you who won the presidential election, who won the election, and why? Here, we are still sort of going through the data in terms of grades, but I wanted to show you a stereotype threat and a measure, a self-report measure of whether they think there are negative stereotypes in school and whether they feel like they are contending with those negative stereotypes. So for an example item, I worry about how others will judge my performance based on the performance of other people in my group. That's one of the items that they respond to. So I just wanted to show you, this is exactly what some of the 6th graders wrote. One student wrote, Barack Obama has shown that you can do whatever you want, no matter what color you are. We put them in exactly how they wrote them. One other black participant wrote, yes, it's important to me, meaning who won the office of the president, because he's the first African-American president. Also, I didn't get my hopes up for McCain because I think he might be too old. So what is the effect of this on self-reported stereotype threat? What we find is a really interesting effect that in these blue bars are white students, whether they're writing about health or Obama, they have similar levels of stereotype threat, self-reported stereotype threat. But for the minority students, black and Hispanic students, when they are asked to write about Obama, merely engaging and thinking about insight related to him, this uniquely reduces their feelings of stereotype threat in school. We're also now beginning to look at data to try to sort out the effect on grades. And so I want to argue that this is less about Obama, but the idea of trying to change the psychological climate, whether it be about schools and children or whether it be about organizations, that these kinds of information, these kinds of interventions can have a dramatic effect on performance. And so when we think about, to conclude, the project of inclusive leadership, thinking about the psychological climate when we can't actually, or it's taking a long time to change the physical climate, can take us really far. And so with that, I will end, and thank you very much.
Some questions now. I can look for hands, and I think we all have microphones. And when you raise your hand, people will bring these wireless mics to you so that your question can be recorded. So I think the first hand is here. Beth, can you bring over a mic?
Hi. I'm wondering if any of you know of, or if any of your research is being applied to the kinds of social groups that exist in corporations. So are you a banker? Are you a salesperson? Are you a Lehman or a Barclays? And how that could be applied to create better, like more successful business practices?
What do you mean? You mean the group identity of being an investment banker?
Well, I mean that within corporations, the social groups that define, the stereotypes that exist could be, are more associated with what a person is doing professionally. So if you're an engineer or you're a PhD versus someone who's an MBA, or someone who is in one department versus another department in a merger and acquisition, it could be who is the parent company versus the acquired company.
I can speak in general. I don't know if any of the research they've actually done, but within this field of research, as it gets applied to the workplace, there's a lot of different settings where stereotypes impede the functioning of organizations. One is the coordination. So if you have two strong professional identities, like traders identifying with traders and bankers with bankers, it's very hard to do cross-selling and to kind of have a sort of one bank, approach to things. And so organizations really try to break that down. After mergers, you get a situation where the Bank of America people don't really want to coordinate with the Lehman people, or, and then the final thing is that stereotypes sometimes lead to underestimating the competition. If you start to think, okay, we're Goldman and nobody can touch us because we're, you can underestimate the competition. So there's, in-group loyalty is really important in business, but the flip side of it is that it promotes this stereotype view of outgroups, and that can get in the way in lots of different ways.
And another suggestion, I mean, related to what Susan talked about this morning, the SCM is useful as a descriptive model, and it's also context specific. So you could do an SCM type of study within your organization. It won't be very difficult. You just find out what the general view within your organization is on the 2 dimensions, warmth and competence, and then you'd have a guide that would point you towards where might be problem areas in terms of how other people are viewed within the group. So it's very context specific, so it's very descriptive, so it's easy to sort of replicate within your own organization.
Last question. One more, because we'll cut it off. So 2 more questions. This one, then this one. Okay, we'll ask both questions, and then we'll have answers to both of them. Okay.
This is a very sort of specific question for Professor Carney. I was just intrigued by why the doctors who are lower in implicit prejudice and suspicious about the content of the study or aware of what it's getting at, why they would not treat the black patient. It seems like a very surprising and puzzling effect.
So you're saying that there's
why you got such a strong negative or such a strong
positive
correlation between bias and treatment. You would think you would just get a mean effect for everybody treating the black patient more once they realize the study is about race.
Yeah, right, rise there. So you're talking about the subjects that were aware.
Yes.
So that was just, those were just about the black patients. I didn't show you the white patient data, right? So, right, so I think you're asking about a comparison that I didn't show you.
You showed that the more biased whites were more willing to treat the black patient,
Yes.
which is bizarre.
When you were aware of the study, like so what we're seeing, so you could imagine it being a little bit bizarre. It seems counterintuitive, right? But what we're starting to see, and I think David Amodio talked about it a little bit too, is that something's happening where these stereotypes are sort of simmering below the surface, but whether you act on them and how you act on them can be influenced by not only your awareness of the context of sort of like how salient race might be, or how motivated you might be to correct for those prejudices. And so we're starting to see these effects where, there was this one effect by Richardson and Shelton, which showed that it's not that biased whites treat blacks more negatively. You actually see situations in which they sort of treat them more positively. So it's not clear exactly what the situational presses are that moderate the extent to which bias predicts negative things, but it is clear that we're beginning to see these overcorrection effects. So I totally agree with you that at first blush it seems counterintuitive, but it is not a lone effect. And so the question we now face is, what are those conditions?
Okay, one more question.
Yeah, Valerie, I was interested in what I think I'm interpreting this right, that after the value exercise, the white people students did less well.
Yes, yeah.
So I don't understand that.
So that's interesting. Before I answer your question, I just want to take a second to acknowledge Rachel Sumner, who's the lab manager who runs this project. I forgot her, and she actually does all my slides and everything. So she'll never help me again if I don't acknowledge her. Hi, Rachel. I just embarrassed you. So to answer your question, we get these really interesting effects with white participants for this line of research, both in middle school and in high school and with the college sample. What seems to happen is that the white participants, when writing about the self, and in particular writing about their group, they tend to show this dip in performance. It never winds up being significant, but when you look at it across a number of studies, I do think it has meaning, particularly in terms of practical significance. One of the things that I know of is what's driving that particular effect in the study with the college students are white students actually writing about their fraternities and their sororities. So it's not that they're writing about, I'm not making a commentary on fraternities and sororities, I'm explaining to you what's driving the effect. And so they're not writing about racial identity. They seem to be writing about fraternities and sororities. And in particular, we did a lot of mining there because we were trying to figure out what's going on. It seems that particular value, the more they write about that seems to be associated with lower performance. And so, it makes sense in the sense that different kinds of groups can have different sorts of effects on performance. And so We think that this is intriguing. We also find these sort of mild fluctuations when you look at the middle school data. Sometimes the performance of white students, there's a little slight dip, sometimes it goes up. And so it's not clear whether it's a persistent negative drop when you affirm your values, but it's certainly something that we think about a lot. It also tells you a lot about what you should do in terms of intervening. The focus is really on the targeted group and not so much the non-targeted group.
This is a great discussion. Let's continue it during the coffee break. Our coffee break's been a little shortened, so we're gonna have a quick coffee break of about 5 minutes, but that should be enough time to refuel and reawaken your brain cells. And then we're coming to a great panel about practice and policy.